Hello everybody, welcome back. And today we are going to get into the details of the revolution. We've spent a few days taking a look at the causes of the revolution, the buildup, all the things that colonists tried, along with the British, to avoid war. And today we're getting into the war itself. So if you haven't already, go ahead and download part 2 of the notes here. The note sheet should look like what we have in front of you here. And then go ahead and pause this video and answer this first question in pink. So remember, these pink sections are the required sections. You'll turn this in tomorrow after we finish up this note sheet. We'll do about half of it today. So go ahead and tell us, what is the major difference between the Patriots and the Loyalists? All right. Get into this then. See if it ever loads. All right, so here we are with the American Revolution, and tomorrow we'll be hitting on the War of 1812 as well. But the Revolution is where we are today. What is happening? All right, here we go. So as we really dive into wars, we've already been talking about the revolution for a while, but I think it's good for us to pause here and just talk about what is a war. And to take a look at the number of years that the U.S. has been engaged in warfare since 1776. We have had some sort of military conflict happening, and what I mean by that is open, sometimes declared armed hostilities between states or nations. This does not include specific individual terror groups outside of that. But for 93% or so of our history, we have been involved in some sort of military conflict. Some of them have been outright declared wars, and some of them not so much. But that is a significant part of our time as a country. And so one of the things we're going to be doing here is going through and talking about kind of the why. Why do we continue to have these military conflicts? So this is all review, right? We've talked about all these things, these British policies leading up to the revolution itself. And you should have all these definitions down pretty well at this point. We've done these a couple of times already in class. And so with each one of these new laws that passed, we see a build-up in tension around what's happening throughout the colonies as they're becoming more and more frustrated with what they feel is that their lack of rights, that they feel like the British Parliament is taking away their rights as British citizens, and until they get those rights back, they really just aren't going to be happy no matter what happens here. And so each thing kind of builds on the next, which builds on the next. Now, in this time of building tension, we see a lot of rioting starting to take place, especially by the time you get to the late 1760s and 1770s. And so there is a young man, 12-year-old, by the name of Christopher Sider, and he is really credited as kind of technically the first casualty of the revolution. He is a part of a protest mob, and there is a man that is considered a loyalist fires a warning shot into the mob so that to get away from his home, his property. And with that warning shot, he accidentally wounds, and eventually the boy dies. So the Sons of Liberty, and they did the same thing with the Boston Massacre too, they used this tragic event as a way to promote the need to continue to push away from British ideas. And they're going to hold a huge funeral for him. They make it a very, very public event just to show how evil those loyalists were during this time. And again, this is another step in raising those tensions throughout Boston specifically. Shortly after that, we get the Boston Massacre. And so we're going to pause here and we'll watch this video that will review the Boston Massacre for us.
In 1763, Great Britain defeated the French and their Native American allies in the French and Indian War. defending the American colonies was expensive, and to help pay for it, the British started taxing American goods like sugar, paper, and tea. Colonists were frustrated. They couldn't even vote in Parliament, and American patriots protested through petitions, boycotts, and violence. Massachusetts was especially vocal in its dissent. The arrival of British redcoats to keep order in Boston convinced many patriots that oppression was coming. One evening, an argument between a small redcoat contingent and local patriots escalated into a scuffle. Soon, an angry crowd had gathered.
Lobster scoundrels! No one wants you here!
Go back to England!
Dirty dogs put rocks in the snowballs!
Amidst the melee, someone yelled fire. No one knew whom.
Can't see. The captain ordered us to fire. Don't fire! Stop your firing!
Five Bostonians were killed, including African-American Crispus Attucks, who is sometimes called the first man killed in the American Revolution. The colonists were furious. The British troops were moved out of the city, the soldiers involved were arrested, and engravers like Paul Revere of future fame published lithographs of the bloody massacre. Believing that everyone deserved a fair trial, a local lawyer and future president, John Adams, agreed to defend the soldiers. To everyone's surprise, all the soldiers except two were found innocent because they were acting in self-defense. The trial gave John a national reputation, launching him to the Continental Congress, where he would become a founding father and help write the Declaration of Independence. But the people of Massachusetts would not forget the Boston Massacre. In a few years, violence broke out again and set off the American Revolution.
Right, and that is where we're heading next here. All right, so that Boston Massacre, like they said, tensions particularly high in Boston itself. We see a lot of pushback, a lot of work by the Sons of Liberty in Boston, Massachusetts. It's going to start a group of young boys hanging out, throwing snowballs, rocks hidden in the snowballs, ice. So we're looking at in teenage age people. Eventually, that crowd is going to grow. This officer on duty there calls for help, for backup, basically, and so more soldiers are going to come in. That's going to cause more the crowd to grow as they see what's happening, and eventually the violence escalates until somewhere in the mix, someone yells fire, and nobody really knows who it was. The British officer really insists it wasn't him, but in the end, no matter who called what, you had 5 colonists shot and 6 injured. And so we did cover this briefly in class yesterday. All right, so they did mention Crispus Attucks there in that video, and he's a citizen of Boston. He escaped slavery at the age of 27, and one of those obviously initial casualties here. So he worked the docks, and you had a decent number of guys that were losing their jobs at this time because of all the taxes, and the economy was not doing very well. Many of them worked more than one job because they couldn't make ends meet with just the one job, so they're working multiple jobs, and so he became kind of an example of that man. He was shot twice actually in the Boston Massacre, and again the Sons of Liberty are going to use the funerals of all 5 that are killed as a way to, again, promote their ideas of this need for change with the British government. They're not looking for independence at this time, but they're looking for some more aggressive ways to try and get Britain to listen. And so they're going to use this event to do that as well. Another way they use this event is through this print that we talked about in class that Paul Revere did, and used it not to just speak to the people of Boston and the people of Massachusetts, but to speak across the colonies about, hey, look what's happening. So what I want you to do is pause and let's just analyze this document here. What can we conclude about this author's point of view. And by point of view, I don't mean first person or second person, right? What I mean is like his perspective, point of view. What is he trying? What is he showing? What is he trying to get you to think about this? So what I want you to do is just go ahead and answer that. What is the perspective of Paul Revere based on what you see in this image? And how do you know this? Be specific. What do you see that lets you know this? All right. So the Boston Massacre, the site of the Boston Massacre is still there today. They've kept it as this kind of historic, almost a holy ground of where the revolution kind of started here. So you see that the balcony, in front of this balcony is where this took place. Here's the balcony up here, right? So they've kept that intact. And then this was the guardhouse where the British soldiers were stationed. And you could see the circle right here. This is basically where the massacre itself, so kind of was in the street. Obviously, they were in the street. And the streets look very, very different at this time, but they've kind of recognized it with that circle in the ground. All right. So after Boston, again, we've talked about a lot of these events already, but after Boston, we see things kind of chill out for a little bit. They pull back on some of the acts, on those Townsend acts. We have a trial. Right? It takes 7 months to start that trial, but we have the captain, the officer that was at the Boston Massacre, and the soldiers tried. And all of them, except 2, were found not guilty by reason of self-defense. And so that was a big deal for guys like John Adams, who defended those soldiers, and for the Sons of Liberty, who were using that again to spread their message. But for about 3 years or so, you didn't have any major events, no major laws, nothing major changes. However, by 1773, things almost kind of just pick up right where they left off. You have the Tea Act, which we talked about yesterday, that triggers the Boston Tea Party, which triggers the Intolerable Acts. The outbreak of the Intolerable Acts, then get the rest of the colonies to start to figure out, okay, we better meet, and they meet at that First Continental Congress, and they start organizing how they're together. Now they're going to work together to resist Britain. And then we've got a couple of battles before Congress meets again to officially talk about independence. So let's talk about that first battle here. By April of 1775, and if we go back and see what else is happening at this time, the Continental Congress has met the fall before, but for a lot of it, it's kind of business as usual. There's British soldiers everywhere. They're quartering with the people, and around local communities across the colonies, you have an increase in local militias. So what that means is you got local guys that are kind of organizing themselves. They are stashing away weapons in secret locations. And they have organized officers within their local community. So if something happens, they're ready to go. We call those guys the Minutemen, right? They're ready to go at a moment's notice. They're not well trained, but they're ready to specifically defend their communities. And so that is all over New England for sure, and up and down the coast. This is what's happening. Local guys looking to defend their own homes from the British. So it's in that situation where in April of 1775, this guy here, General Gage, general for the British Army, gets word of a couple of things, a couple of tips he gets, probably from local loyalists. One, John Hancock and Sam Adams, 2 of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, they were wanted for breaking a lot of different laws, right? But it was believed that they got a tip that they were in Lexington. And so he wanted to go get them and arrest them. Along the same time, he got a tip that in Concord, just one town over, there was an arsenal of weapons. It was illegal for the colonists to hold weapons like this, and so they wanted to go and get it. So Gage kind of thought, you know what, let's just take care of both of these things at once. So they start out late. It says midnight. I think it was earlier than that, right? But the idea is they're going to start out, they're going to march through the night, They're going to take care of their business, stop in Lexington, they want to arrest those guys when they're sleeping, right? So get them when they're not expecting it. And then they'll swing by Concord on the way back and destroy those weapons, and they'll be back by noon. Kind of a nice, quick round trip. It's only 30 miles or so away. Not too bad for these guys to march. But they needed to move fast because if word got out that they were coming, the element of surprise would be gone, right? Adams and Hancock would be moved somewhere else, and of course the weapons would be moved somewhere else as well. However, there were tons of delays. It took them a much longer to get anywhere than they thought. Meanwhile, within Boston, their own colonial spies kind of figured out what the plan was, and they triggered in motion that midnight ride of Paul Revere. So who was Paul Revere? We've talked about this a little bit already. By trade, he was a silversmith, so he engraved things using silver. Best known for his midnight ride, and truthfully, this was not even that big of a deal at the time. I mean, it was, but he was one of many people that did this sort of thing. But there was a poem written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that specifically made Paul Revere famous. So if you read a storybook about Paul Revere when you were a kid, it probably was a version of this poem on how he rode on brown beauty and he did all the things that we think of him doing. But he was that for him, that was just one of his jobs within the Sons of Liberty, much like many others as well. Right? So he was used to watch those movements and then kind of trigger that information as needed. So on this particular night, Revere does go out. He goes out with another guy by the name of William Dawes also, and they're going to take off. And throughout the evening, they're going to run out. They're going to say, the regulars are coming! Right? And then they'll move on to the next place. So you can see in the map here that they each have their own pre-designed route. Right? This is all set up. So Dawes takes out, and he takes out and goes south first, and Paul Revere is going to go north out of town. And eventually then they'll get to their spot, and there's people here that are going to meet up and take over from him. So Dr. William Prescott is going to take over for Dawes, and they keep moving on down the line. So like I said, they're not the only people that have done this. This is part of the system, and this is going to continue throughout the Revolution. Another famous person that had a similar job, she kind of took it on herself, was a woman by the name of Sybil Ludington. And so if this works, we'll watch her story here. All right, I'm back. I tried my video and then it didn't work, and then my internet went crazy. So moving on, but Sybil Ludington, her dad was an officer, and she saw a need later in the war, jumped on board, and did a very similar thing to what Paul Revere and these guys are doing on this night. All right. So by the time the British troops arrived that morning, much later than they had hoped, of course, Adams and Hancock are long gone. They've been removed. And you have soldiers arriving, and they're facing these militia guys at the outside of town. The British are yelling at them to lay down their arms, you rebels, and they don't. They're not really looking to fight a war. They're totally outnumbered here. They're not looking for a fight. But they are looking to say, hey, like, this is our town, and you can't just march in here and do what you want. So they actually do step aside, and they let them pass. And somewhere in that mix, a gun goes off. Nobody knows if it was intentional or not, but that gun goes off, and that was it. So after that first initial shot, quite naturally, several other shots go off, and the militia are going to run for their lives, and the whole thing is over in like 30 seconds. It's done. And you look around, you have several wounded and others killed already. One British soldier was hit, though not fatally. And once the British kind of figure out what was next and kind of reorganize themselves, they realize that Adams and Hancock are gone. So off they go. They're going to head down 7 miles to the next place and hopefully salvage this trip. when they get to Concord, of course, time has passed and the message has gone ahead, and they are ready for them. The militia uh, basically are there again, waiting for the British. But again, they take them to the place where the weapons are, and of course, they're gone. There's no weapons there at all. And so the British look around and they basically decide they're going to kind of make an example of these guys. And so they just decide to burn everything down. And massive fires, and people are seeing this from far away, and they assume some battle's going on. So actually, you have more militiamen show up because of the fires. They're going to gather on what is the North Bridge, and we're going to see that in a video here in a second, what that looks like. And it's there that really a real battle does ensue, though not very long. And 12 British are going to be hit. Again, three fatally wounded. And by this point, the British have realized this entire trip is just a disaster. None of it has gone the way they wanted to, and the best bet now is just to get back to Boston as quickly as possible. However, it's not quite over for them yet. The way back to Boston was probably the worst part of it for them at all so far. Because as they go, right, all along the way, these militiamen are lined up along the road. And so now they can wait in hiding, and just as the troops walk by, just kind of pick them off as they go. And so it becomes this torturous 40-mile march back to Boston where they don't know where the shots are coming from, and they never know when they're going to come. So the events of that day is going to forever change the world, right? You got 94 colonists dead, missing, or wounded. 65 British soldiers have been killed, and another 200 plus are gone. That's a third of their forces for that day. And this is going to completely change what's going on here. Now, keep in mind, nobody's talking independence yet, right? They're still trying to fix this relationship, but it just got much more intense, to say the least. Right, so we're going to pause and watch this video.
By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Those words by the American poet and Concord native, Ralph Waldo Emerson, get to the crux of what took place here on Wednesday morning, April 19th, 1775, when Patriot and militia units returned fire into the British across the bridge that's behind me, triggering the 8-year odyssey that would become the American War of Independence, also known as the American Revolution. Issues like taxation, representation, respect were at the core of the struggle, and nowhere more was that felt than here in Massachusetts. In early April 1775, Governor General Thomas Gage, commander and military governor of Massachusetts, decided he needed to take action to diffuse the hostile relations between the countryside and the city of Boston. At 10 p.m. on April 18, 1775, Colonel Francis Smith and his adjutant, Major John Pitcairn, lead 800 troops west from Boston, objective Concord, seize the weapons, seize the munitions, return them to Boston, and put an end to colonial hostility. By 5 o'clock in the morning, they are on the verge of reaching the town of Lexington. But express riders, including Paul Revere and William Dawes, had gotten out ahead of them to spread what became known as the Lexington Alarm, arousing the countryside, raising shot, having bells rung, so that Patriot and militia and Minuteman groups could form and could react to the British presence. 70 Minutemen, under the command of Captain John Parker, gather at Buckman's Tavern in Lexington, adjacent to the Green. At 5:30, they get word that the British are in sight. Parker takes his men out of the tavern, crosses over the Green, lines his men up in 2 rows deep, 70 men total, not blocking the road, merely standing there to show their defiance and their anger and hostility. Parker was not looking for a fight. The fight, rather, came to Parker as the British troops came on, entered the Green, and faced off against Parker and his men. Parker recognized that he was outnumbered, but he did tell his men, stand your ground, don't fire unless fire upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. But a shot rings out, and nobody's sure where that shot came from. And the British instinctively fire a volley. 17 fall, either wounded or killed. By the time the British reach Concord at 9 in the morning, Patriot units, militia units, Minutemen units from towns like Acton, Sudbury, Lincoln, Bedford begin to converge here. They can see the smoke curling from the town of Concord. The British are burning the guns, the carriages that they found. They've cut down the Liberty Pole. They're burning that too. But it looks to the Minutemen that the town is being fired, and it is decided to march on the town and either die defending it or die trying to defend it. The head of the band of Minutemen that is going to march on the bridge, he turns to Isaac Davis, the 30-year-old popular captain of the Acton Minutemen, and asks Davis if his men are ready to take the lead. Davis says, "I haven't a man that's afraid to go." The British initially hold a ridge across the river on the western bank, but as soon as they see the numbers, they know they're outnumbered, and they pull back across the bridge, tearing up planks as they retreat. As the Patriot units near the bridge, a volley breaks out, and Davis and several of his men are hit and fall. Davis, mortally wounded, shortly thereafter dies. From the back of the line runs Major John Buttrick of Concord saying, "For God's sakes, men, fire! For God's sakes, fellow soldiers, fire!" And the Americans unleash a volley into the British. That's the shot heard around the world. British troops fall, and the British flee the bridge in panic, heading back to Concord. But it is going to be one hell of a return march. For the Minutemen who know the area have now raced to outflank the British and to meet them along the road that will take them back to Boston. The British are stunned. They're now being fired on by thousands of Minutemen who have converged from 27 towns, and for the next 6 hours, it is a running gunfight between the British and militia and Minuteman units, and nothing has been the same on this planet since. And so began the arduous 8-year journey of the American Revolution and War for Independence.
All right, so a great overview of how this whole thing gets started. Now, keep in mind, it is still a while until the independence is declared. Sorry. So we're going to have a few more of these battles along the way. The next one is going to happen just a couple of months later in June of 1777. We have General Howe. Here he is. And he's thinking back on what happened on Lexington, and he is pretty frustrated. When we look at the Battle of Bunker Hill, he was looking to retake that high ground at whatever cost necessary. This was a really hot day, and the colonial troops, the militiamen in that area, were at the top of the hill. They had taken that hill, and so Howe is going to march his men up that hill, whatever it takes to get it done. So we're looking at a 500 yards uphill. That we call it, it's the Battle of Bunker Hill. Actually, the hill was called Breed's Hill, which is super confusing that they gave it a different name. But what happens is these guys march up, and the colonists would fire down on them. They got the upper ground, so they're firing down at them, and they push them back down. Right, and then Howe would send them back up again, and they'd fire down on them, and they'd push back down. Now, on that third time, the story is that the colonial commanders told the men, "Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes." So it means they're really close, and then take them out. And that's exactly what happened. But after that last one, they took off, and they actually gave up the hill. So in theory, technically, they are losing that particular battle. They lost the hill. However, what they did do is, because the British continued to push, they were able to see that the colonists meant business here, and you had significant amount of British soldiers were killed. 90 officers were killed in this, and they didn't give up. They pushed and pushed and pushed until the final second when they couldn't hold it any longer. And so this battle becomes about showing the British that we're in this. Like, we're not going away. We're going to keep fighting, and we're going to make sure we survive another day here. All right, I think we are going to stop there for today. So tomorrow, when you are back in class, we're going to pick up with the crossing of the Delaware. By this point, we will have signed the Declaration of Independence, and so the whole war kind of takes a different turn at that point. Make sure in your notes here that you have made your way through all of this. Make sure you're getting the definitions of this stuff in. Make sure you're organized for that test coming up here in a couple of days. And if I ever scroll, we should be doing all of these pink sections here today. All right, we'll cut it off right here. We'll pick up with the Delawarean class tomorrow. Thanks, guys. Hope you had a great day. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye-bye.